Welcome. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Katherine Reynolds Lewis, and I'm the author of The Good News About Bad Behavior: Why Kids Are Less Disciplined Than Ever and What to Do About It. I'm also a certified parent educator with the Parent Encouragement Program here in Kensington, Maryland. I've been helping lead PEP parenting classes since 2012. But first and foremost, I'm a journalist. For the last 5 years, I've been looking at the question across the country, trying to understand, why don't kids do what we want? I observed the country's most effective discipline programs in homes and in schools to learn what works. I followed parents, educators, scientists, and psychologists to try to understand what's actually working in the field. And I also included in the book plenty of real-life stories and practical advice to help you put the theory into practice. You can see the data from the National Institutes of Mental Health. This was a huge longitudinal study of more than 10,000 teenagers, showed a dramatic increase in anxiety, mood, and behavioral disorders. So you may say, wait a minute, I just came here to try to figure out how to get my kids to cooperate. Why are you talking about disorders? Well, a lot of the behaviors that end up being a diagnosis are also the kind of behaviors that we find in our homes and our schools that are troublesome. So for instance, the kid who signs up for swim class is super excited about it, and then the time comes to get in the car and go to practice, and they refuse. So the parent may just find this, of course, very challenging to deal with on the spot, but it may actually be that the child has some fear or difficulty with transitions, and those are the kinds of things that for some children might actually rise to the level of an anxiety diagnosis. In schools, the kid who's jumping out of their seat, who can't seem to sit still, who's always poking their neighbor, may be a kid who has some kind of, somewhere on the spectrum of ADHD. So all of these behaviors are troublesome in schools and homes, and the more that we understand what's causing kids, the more that we can really understand what this resistance to cooperation is underneath. So the end result is when you look at all of these disorders together, 1 in 2 children will have one of these conditions by the time they're 18 years old. So maybe this is overdiagnosis. To me, this was very convincing, and I hope not completely depressing, because if you do have a child who's dealing with one of these challenges, you're not alone. There are probably half of the parents or half of the kids in your neighborhood are also dealing with some kind of challenge around mood or behavioral issues. So the final piece of data that I'll talk about before I turn to the tools for winning cooperation in your home are some pretty disturbing data on teen suicide, and that convinced me that there really is a fundamental change in children. So as you can see from this slide, the Center for Disease Control has found that the teen suicide rate for 15 to 19-year-olds has climbed 30% in the last 10 years. And for younger children, 10 to 14-year-olds, it's up even more, 50%. And as someone I interviewed for the book, Dennis Embry, told me, you can't overdiagnose dead bodies. There's no getting around that this is a real change in what's happening with children today. And again, I'm not sharing this to alarm you, but simply to make the case for why these tools that I'm going to share with you that are in the book and that we teach here at PEP are needed today. It's not that somehow we're coddling our children by trying to get down to their level and understand their hearts. It's that there's just something different. And so my parents and certainly my grandparents didn't do a lot of the things that I do with my children now. It doesn't mean that they were wrong. Of my book is that we're all in this together. We're trying to figure out this new generation of children and support them. And I do believe that not only are we going to find that these tools are effective, but that the diagnosis is not some kind of sentence. It's actually a way of understanding our children and having them understand themselves. Now, you've probably figured out that when I see a child who's acting out, I don't think that's a bad kid or that's someone who's needs to be managed. I see a child who simply doesn't have the skills needed to control themselves. I see a child who needs help with self-regulation. So let's talk a little bit about what does help kids self-regulate. And here we come to the first tool, which is connection, and some really interesting science about how connection helps kids who have some of these issues, whether it's a diagnosis or just feelings of fear or stress. So an interesting study by Greg Siegel, who's a scientist at the University of Pittsburgh, he was studying children who have an anxiety diagnosis. And it turned out some of these kids wanted their mom in the scanner room with them when they were having their brains scanned by an MRI machine. And some of the kids didn't ask for that. And it was an accidental finding, but the research team decided, well, we should probably compare those two groups of kids to see if there's some difference. And to their surprise, the children who had their mother standing right by their side, not even touching them, but just being present, their brains looked entirely the same as kids without an anxiety diagnosis. Their amygdala wasn't reactive the way that kids with anxiety usually show. And this led to a whole field of science about moms and dads being physically present with their kids, and how that helps kids to regulate their bodies, regulate their emotions and their thoughts. So for us as parents, this means that we're going to, as much as possible, use touch, empathy, modeling, which I'll talk about in a second, to help our kids to learn how to regulate their emotions so that when we're not with them, they'll have that practice. Their brain will understand better how to calm down from that excited state.